It's a heartbreaking mystery out of Utah. A mother and son gunned down in what should have been the safety of their own home. Jessica Lyman, a mother of three, and her son, 8-year-old Eli Painter, murdered. Both found reportedly unconscious and covered in blood from gunshot wounds. Police confirm it was Lyman's teenage daughter who made the 911 call after stumbling upon the unimaginable. Jessica was still breathing, barely. She was rushed by helicopter in a desperate attempt to save her life, but just days later, she was gone. Now, nearly a week later, no arrests, no suspects named, and no motive revealed. Who would want this family dead? Was it someone they knew or a stranger? Could the answer be hiding in plain sight? And what did those surviving children see or hear? I'll break down what happened and walk you through the details. For Law and Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker. For this story, we go to Saratoga Springs, Utah, a city roughly 35 miles south of Salt Lake City. There, a community is left devastated, trying to understand how a mother and son were shot inside their own home. It was the morning of March 28th, 2025. Just after 10 a.m., Saratoga Springs police received a 911 call. According to Saratoga Springs police, a 17-year-old girl had just returned home and found her mother, Jessica Lyman, and 8-year-old brother, Eli Painter, shot and covered in blood. Police say another sibling, a 15-year-old boy, was also inside the home at the time. He was uninjured. First responders rushed to the scene and tried to desperately save both mom and son. But for little Eli, it was already too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Jessica was still clinging to life. She was airlifted in critical condition to a nearby hospital. Investigators sealed off the home, collecting evidence and interviewing family members. In a press conference, Saratoga Springs Police Chief Bill Robertson made it clear no one was being ruled out.
Everybody's a suspect to us right now until we can get down the road on some things and start piecing it together.
While investigators said there was no danger to the public, detectives were sent to the hospital as Jessica fought for her life.
It's critical condition, extremely critical condition. So, and she's got family at the hospital too.
3 days later, Jessica died from her injuries. Police confirmed her two surviving children, who have a different father than Eli, are now with their biological father. The house remains a crime scene as detectives work to uncover who pulled the trigger. Eli's obituary describes him as energetic, loving, and full of curiosity. He was born on Valentine's Day and is remembered by those who knew him as someone who brought joy and warmth into every room. Jessica is remembered as a great mother, described by loved ones as loyal, fierce, and full of life. Now, more than a week after the shooting, there's still no arrests, no named suspects, and no clear answers. Just a haunting question that remains unanswered. Who would want this mother and son dead, and why? And joining me to talk more about this is retired police chief Mike King. Mike, thank you so much for coming on today. Let's jump right in. What is the first thing officers are trained to do when they arrive at a double shooting scene like this?
I'll tell you, these are so complex when you walk through the door. And the first thing, obviously, is you want to secure that scene. You want to make sure that everyone inside that is alive is being treated and cared for. If there are people that are inside that are not associated with the homicide in this particular case, you want to also get them into a little bit of a controlled environment where you can make sure that they're not going to further contaminate the scene. If the victim is clearly deceased, then you're going to want to keep firefighters and other people from coming in. If there's any chance of a life-saving opportunity, then you got to let them go in, which sometimes really creates a lot of distraction and a lot of evidence that becomes problematic down the road.
How does law enforcement typically determine whether a crime was targeted versus random?
You know, as you think about this particular case, what I do or what I did when I was a young investigator was you start looking at the environment and the behavior, and you try to look at it in totality rather than just, looking at one specific thing. Number one, the kinds of wounds that you're seeing on the victim, would they be something that would have happened with close contact? physical one-on-one, and where we know this is a shooting, we don't know if this was from a long rifle, a long-barreled weapon, and could have happened from the street corner, or if it was something that happened at close range. So you look at things like, is there some gunpowder burns around the wound? They call it stippling. This idea that maybe there was a close range shot versus something that happened out in front of the house and through the picture window. But when you have two victims, you start looking at some of the behaviors inside of the room from the perspective of, where are those wounds? Are they wounds that would appear that the person who pulled the trigger was facing head on, or was one of the wounds a victim who may have been running away from the scene and shot as they were trying to flee? So all of these things can start providing some real interesting behaviors that can help you kind of theorize what was going on in the crime scene. And then you got to look more beyond just the victim themselves and start looking at the crime scene in totality. Is there something that indicates that the predator in this particular case forced their way into the residence, or were they somehow able to con their way in, or they're known to the victims and they walked in?
And one thing that I found was interesting is shortly after, police came to the scene, there was a press conference, and the police chief said that everyone is a suspect. What does that actually mean from an investigative standpoint?
Primarily, it means that they don't know who did it, for one thing, that they haven't been able to isolate, that there wasn't someone with a smoking gun saying, hey, I did it, I give up. Uh, and rightly so, everyone needs to be a suspect, from uh, the family members to the community to the unknown predator. And so, what you really do, we oftentimes want to look at these cases and come up with this real quick answer or question of who done it. And in reality, what we need to do is kind of change our focus and focus on who are the victims in this case and why did they become a victim, because that often opens up some real possibility of who potentially would be the person that might have committed this crime. So if in fact this was a targeted homicide, usually statistically, what we've learned over time is that people who are targeted as victims, the person who kills them is usually known to them, or at least knows who they are, maybe by peeking through the window of the house, or stalking them. But there is a relationship between this, when the victim is low risk. And without knowing Jessica Lyman or her son, it would appear, based on their lifestyle, the kind of place that they're living, the way they dress, what you can learn by some of the things we're hearing about their background, these were probably low-risk people. So that makes you really start to wonder, is it someone in a closer inner circle that's involved in this homicide? And then if it is someone closer, then what was the reasoning behind that? But there's always this quick knee-jerk reaction we have to jump to a conclusion that, oh, it's got to be a family member, or it's got to be the next door neighbor, or whatever the case may be. But what we've also learned is that when we look at the victimology, or the study of the victim, that they can change everything by maybe circumstances or environment or a situation. So it could be that a random person's walking down the road selling magazines who truly is a predator and uses that con to get inside. And because this low risk victim opens the door, all of a sudden this victim is a victim of opportunity, not a victim who's targeted. So it's kind of interesting that we want to jump to a conclusion, because in our minds, we just want this thing solved. We want to know that we're safe, and we want to know why this mom and her 8-year-old son are killed.
What are some investigative red flags that could raise suspicion early on?
Well, you immediately, again, I think the most critical thing law enforcement has to do in these kinds of investigations, outside of securing the scene and collecting physical evidence, is to conduct those interviews. We know that there was a 15-year-old boy in the home. Was he in the home and was he aware of what happened? Or was he wearing earphones and completely unaware of what happened? And we don't know any of these answers, and we want to jump to conclusions, but we just don't know. We know that a daughter walked in and found her parents or her mother and her brother and made this 911 phone call. So we have to know that first and foremost, we've got to start conducting interviews. But then the interviews continue in ways of forensics or behavior. And we look at all of these traditional forms of evidence that are collected at crime scenes. But then we start introducing in these ideas of, based on theory sometimes, of who might have a reason. Is there a vindictive family member? Is there a business deal that's gone wrong? What's going on in their life that would have created any risk for them?
And let's talk more about those interviews. How do police typically approach interviews with family members who are also potential witnesses or suspects?
Well, in this particular case, again, you have to think about the emotional impact that this homicide, once it's discovered, if the boy didn't hear it happening in that house, that all of a sudden he's faced with the trauma of this horrendous crime scene. If he was involved in some way, was a participant who escaped or a participant who had some role in it, those things become really important too, because then you're talking about Mirandizing someone and questioning them as a potential suspect versus questioning them as a witness to a crime that occurred. So there are so many different dynamics going on in these kinds of investigations, which really points to the fluidity of these cases and the role that law enforcement plays in quickly assessing. And sometimes we go to court and we watch the courts argue for months and months over whether a police officer made the right decision in that fraction of a second or the wrong decision. Think about all the decisions that are being made just on the questions that you've asked me today about walking into a crime scene where two bodies are dead, determining whether they're alive or dead, whether they need help or whether they're beyond help, starting to control that crime scene so that you can collect physical evidence and forensic evidence, determining what information should be captured before a cell phone goes into automatic shutdown mode or logs off and you need a password versus being able to see who the last caller was on a cell phone. All of these things that are happening that a police officer today has to make instantaneous decisions on, including, am I going to interview this individual as a witness or as a suspect, or am I going to wait because of the trauma and have a forensic examiner talk to him and do it in a more clinical setting? All of these things have to happen all at once, and it constantly reminds me of what responsibility we place on first responders when they respond to cases like this.
And clearly we are speculating here, but we know that it's just tough to interview anyone, let alone a minor who just lost their parent. But do we think that that's the reason why we still don't have any type of idea about a suspect because they haven't interviewed the son yet?
Boy, I have no idea, but what I am doing, as much as I don't like it as a journalist, I'm really grateful that the police department's remaining tight-lipped and they're securing and protecting their criminal case, because they've got to build a case against someone, and they don't want to let someone know that they're looking at them too quickly in hopes that they might make some mistakes. There might be some forensic mistakes or some other things. And so I find myself, now that I'm out of the law enforcement profession, like you, wishing I could get more information, but then I'm also quietly cheering that they're keeping their lips really tight and they're investigating a homicide.
But you've been doing this for a long time. Is it, and I know every case is different. Is it normal that, a week or, more has gone by and we don't have any idea about any type of suspect in this case? I mean, a mother and her young son killed in the home and they haven't released anything.
It is probably becoming the norm in this digital age that we're living in. And I wonder, and this is something I just personally speculate about, that if we're not seeing less being shared now because so much is inappropriately shared by social media, by creators in YouTube and Twitter and everywhere else, that if I were in charge of investigations, I would be more tight-lipped, knowing that I can at least control some of that information. As frustrating as it is to me now on this side of the fence.
Well, how exactly do detectives determine if someone inside the home may have been involved or truly didn't see anything? How would they go about figuring that out?
Well, if we were to be specific to this case, and if there were questions of whether, for instance, the 15-year-old had something to do with this, simple tests like gunshot residue tests on the hands to determine if there's gunpowder residue, that blowback on the hands of the individual, if there's intimate knowledge about things that happened that only the perpetrator would know, those kinds of things start to help you as you kind of figure out whether this person's a suspect or a witness to the crime. And those are the kinds of things that are going on in this case. It may be extending into looking at the social media of the victims, and were there transactions on their social media that suggest somebody's getting elevated in their anger or frustration. And those kinds of things would lead you to looking at people more closely. And as the chief said, everyone needs to be a suspect until they can be eliminated. And I always think about the wise counsel of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, if you remember, penned all the Sherlock Holmes books. He said it's a capital mistake to make your mind up before you have all the facts. Because if you do that, you spend all your time trying to twist facts to meet your theory rather than just letting all of the information unfold and come up with an actual theory that makes sense and is backed by evidence.
Yeah, and that definitely makes a lot of sense. Well, when police are investigating incidents like this one, not this one specifically, but any type of, shooting or homicide investigation, how important is the position of the bodies or the direction of bullet wounds when building a timeline?
Absolutely important. In fact, I think we're seeing the realities of that, how important that is, even in the opening statements of like the Lori Daybell case against Charles Vallow right now, where they specifically said that first round appears to have been inflicted as someone stood directly in front of the victim and fired a weapon. But the second round appears to have come from the lower part of the body exiting out of the top, indicating that the victim was laying on the ground and executed at the time that second shot was fired. So as you think about this particular case, where those wounds are and the amount of wounds are going to be really something that's indicative to, was this just a plain out execution? Was it a very anger driven homicide, which is hard to separate the two? Homicide is homicide. And are there defensive wounds or wounds that would indicate that the victim was running away and shot, like in the back or something like that? All of these are going to paint a crucial picture that will help identify what was going on at the time those murders occurred.
And what can shell casings or bullet trajectories tell you about a possible suspect as well?
Well, clearly, if the bullet exits the body or where it ends up in the body, it's going to tell you the angle that it had to be fired. Bullets travel in a straight line. Now, if you want to get really scientific, a bullet will actually go up in elevation and then drop down to the point that it's sighted in to hit the right point on the target. If it's a long rifle, for instance, but you can pretty well plan on the fact that if a bullet were to enter here in my chest and exit up here on my shoulder, you can almost draw a straight line that says that bullet started at some point at the end of this line. Bullets aren't going to curve and move through. So trajectory, where the bullet ends up, all of that is incredibly important from a forensic standpoint. And where the casings end up are also going to be incredibly interesting, because you can actually start to project scientifically how far a casing should expand or jump from the weapon when it's fired and then the casing is sent out of the weapon. And if you recover a weapon that you believe is the murder weapon, you can compare that casing to the weapon itself. you can fire that weapon and see how far does the casing fly when it comes out. Each of these become really important forensic kinds of tools that you can say, we feel really comfortable that this weapon caused this person's death.
And when they find evidence like this, how often are detectives re interviewing the same people as just the case continues to evolve?
If the person's smart, they're not interviewing him at all because they've said, I want a lawyer, and they're not talking anymore. So sometimes when investigators get a chance to go back, we say you can usually only get one dip at the well. If they get a chance to go back, it's usually very short lived because people are figuring out, hey, I've got some real liability here, and they ask for an attorney. So not very often do we see people coming back, but in cases, in my experience, where people were very arrogant and felt like they were smarter than the system and the investigator, they'll sometimes continue to try to profess their innocence and continue to say, I'll be interviewed, because that in essence is saying, I'm innocent, I don't have anything to hide. So I don't know, that's a tough question. I rarely do you get many returns to dip water from the well.
Right, right. I understand. Well, from your experience, what typically breaks a case open like this?
Well, on a case like this, I think what will break it open is if there are digital footprints that suggest any kind of animosity or a growing problem, something to suggest. Again, it really boils down to the victimology, and then you start looking at who are the suspects in this possible pool of suspects that most likely align with these kinds of frustrations. And then from there, it's just determining based on forensic evidence. Is there phone data that says, hey, whether you want to tell us you were there or not, your phone is telling us you were in that home, or your fingerprint is suggesting you were there and you shouldn't have been, or whatever. And so it's going to be a combination to make a successful case. It's going to be a combination of physical evidence, of forensic evidence, of eyewitness accounts if they are there. Maybe during the interview process, if there are confessions or admissions one way or another. And then the idea that there might actually be behavioral evidence that supports the kinds of things that went on.
Well, thank you so much. I definitely appreciate you coming on, and we will be following this case very closely.
Yeah, it's a crazy one. Thank you.
The victims' families have created a GoFundMe page. They say funds will go towards covering immediate expenses and providing necessary emotional support as they work through this painful journey. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.